You're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Patrick Lawrence has a piece in Consortium News entitled Biden's Secret Stash. If this president didn't know he was in possession of classified documents, in some cases for more than a decade, he simply is not qualified to hold any public office, allowing him access to such. How serious of a problem is this, and what does it say about the maintenance of secret documents? Well, for insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So let me get I'll throw it to you and let you take it where you think it needs to go. I know that if I were found to be in possession of secret documents, I'd be looking at a minimum of 5 to 10 years in prison per document. And whether I was entitled to have them at some point or not, the fact that whenever that time lapses or expires, those documents have to go back from whence they've come. Dr. Gerald Horne.
Well, that's a fair point, the double standard. But this story is proliferating on a number of fronts. Number one, you may have heard that at the home of Vice President Michael Pence, documents have been uncovered. Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, demagogue number one, to be sure, has suggested that the hundreds of boxes of Senator Biden located at the University of Delaware be searched. Apparently, they're not open as of yet to researchers. We know that there is something curious about the so-called Penn Biden Center, affiliated with the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, where some of these documents were originally found, because we know that this relationship was quite lucrative to Mr. Biden, and as a possible payoff, the president of University of Pennsylvania, Amy Gutmann, was appointed to the prestigious post of U.S. ambassador to Germany. But having said that, I think that there might be a deeper problem for Mr. Biden. And I think that this document gate story might only be a cover for the anti-Trump wing of the U.S. ruling class to deem it appropriate for him to wave bye-bye before November 2024 and open up the Democratic presidential race for Governor Pritzker of Illinois, who, by the way, is one of the richest men in the United States of America and has been heard to speak in stage whispers about his presidential ambitions, not to mention Governor Whitmer of Michigan, Governor Newsom of California, and need I mention Vice President Harris as well. Because Mr. Biden has really compromised the international position of U.S. imperialism, and it's difficult to see a way out as long as he is in the Oval Office. What I mean is, I recall that we talked previously about the rumblings in Europe about the possible incipient stages of World War III and the possibility that North Atlantic imperialism would not emerge intact from this confrontation with Russia and China. At the same time, we see that China is going from triumph to triumph in Africa, which is compromising the ability of the North Atlantic countries to rely upon that continent, which, needless to say, through the African slave trade and systematic plunder, helped to catapult the North Atlantic countries into the pole position. And then we see the spectacle of Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, being feted in South Africa as we speak. And in that context of a possible undermining of President Biden so that he will be persuaded to leave office, after all, if he were to be elected or reelected in November 2024, he'd be 86 by the end of his second term. And so he already promised during the presidential race in 2019, 2020, that he was just a bridge to the future. And so in some ways, the deck is stacked against him. But I should also mention some of the personnel moves that have taken place. The departure of his chief of staff, Mr. Klain, and his replacement by Mr. Zients, who not only, as you know, was a former so-called COVID coordinator, but happens to be one of the richest men in the United States of America, believe it or not. Not only that, and this is also a rather curious detail, he's married to an heiress to a major fortune from South Africa, apartheid South Africa, built on mining, which means built upon the brutalization of black labor. And that, I'm afraid to say, is coupled with the fact that the notorious Hunter Biden, the president's son, is also married to a woman with deep roots in apartheid South Africa, not to mention an unrelated point about the so-called richest man in the United States, if not the world, Elon Musk, also having similar ties. Now, the fact that Mr. Zients is part of the 1% shows, at least it suggests, I should say, how the U.S. ruling elite is trying to get a handle, a closer handle, a firmer handle on the White House. And the South African connection, perhaps it portends or helps to shed light on why there is so much anger in South Africa right now, because, of course, there was a critique of South Africa's engaged in military maneuvers with the Russians and the Chinese as we speak. And, of course, there's discontent with South Africa's relationship with the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, which is expanding and portends a challenge to the so-called G7 led by the United States, the Western European nations, Japan, and Canada. And so to sum up, it seems to me that Mr. Biden is facing a real problem with this documentscape, but the problem might be deeper than just being sloppy with records.
Reuters reports Burkina Faso, to stay on Africa, has decided to end a military accord that allowed French troops to fight insurgents on its territory because the government wants the country to defend itself. The government said on Monday. I suspect, looking at their history, there's more to it than that. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, certainly there is more to it than that. You know that Mr. Macron, the French president, visited the White House a few weeks ago. And despite the conflict with the United States over the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a real stumbling block in terms of better relations between the European Union and Washington, there is unity on the question of further exploitation of Africa. Certainly, French imperialism is assisted mightily by AFRICOM, the Africa Command of the Pentagon, by U.S. satellite assets as well. But France is in a real corner right now because I think that the correlation of forces in France domestically, with an energetic working class, they've been marching in the millions in recent days over some of Mr. Macron's domestic policies. And that may help to explain why you've had these stories coming out of France that are more perceptive than many of their counterparts in the United States with regard to the incipient stages of World War III. But also, if you look at what's happening in Europe right now with all of this talk about sending more weapons to Ukraine, I think that the French, and perhaps even the mostly somnolent German ruling class as well, might see a deeper agenda. That is to say, that these weapons will be going into Poland in the first instance. Poland's relationship with France and Germany is deteriorating, not least because Poland is pressing a claim for about $1 trillion in reparations from Berlin's depredations in that country during World War II. But also Poland is aligning with the Baltics, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and all of them are in league with U.S. imperialism. And it seems to me that the wiser heads in France and Germany perhaps see down the road just like we can see down the road, perhaps there is a larger agenda with regard to Documentsgate. There might be a larger agenda with regard to the United States aligning with the Poles and the Balts against the interests of France and Germany. I don't think we can rule that out. And so Mr. Macron is in a real crisis when it comes to Africa, because that is the source and the seat of France's pretension to being a major power. That is the source of France being able to reap a lot of wealth from Africa and through the so-called CFA, which is this common currency that is used in West Africa, with the source of that wealth basically resting in Paris. But with the rise of the Chinese currency, the renminbi, de-dollarization going across the globe, the fact that the Brazilians and the Argentines are talking about a new currency as well, France's position is rather shaky right now. And with millions of workers marching against Mr. Macron, anything could happen.
If you look at what's going on with France and Burkina Faso, and you add Mali to the discussion, it's interesting in this U.S. News article, they've got to throw Russia into the conversation. As they say, Macron has accused Russia of a quote unquote predatory influence in African countries as Mali and Russia are having military support conversations.
Well, that's consistent with the condemnation of South Africa because of their hosting Mr. Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, they're being part of the BRICS, et cetera. And all of this is reflective of the fact that we're living through a tumultuous moment where the hegemony of the North Atlantic nations is being challenged on many fronts. One of the reasons why, to quote the aforementioned article from France, from Le Figaro, the French intellectual Emmanuel Todd, where he suggests that this incipient stage of World War III that he discusses might suggest that North Atlantic imperialism may not emerge intact from this confrontation, and therefore you can expect more hysteria coming out of both Washington and Paris in coming days, weeks, months, and perhaps years.
Greenville Post, the New York Times is Orwell's Ministry of Truth, a pretentious warmongering cabal strutting around as exemplars of real journalism. Your thoughts?
Well, the New York Times is in a real crisis right now because the Sulzberger family that controls that enterprise is finding it difficult to compete with Rupert Murdoch, the Australian-American billionaire who controls the Wall Street Journal, or Jeff Bezos, the billionaire who controls the Washington Post. Bloomberg, another billionaire, supposedly wants to buy the New York Times and the Washington Post, for example. And the Sulzbergers, it seems to me, as a result, are as in much crisis as U.S. imperialism. And therefore, we should expect their editorial pages to reflect that hysteria, particularly with regard to Ukraine, which they have done, because they see, or perhaps sense, I should say more accurately, that this is a real crisis that U.S. imperialism has stumbled into, and U.S. imperialism may not emerge intact from this crisis.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.